The morning mist clung to the pine-covered hills of Clearwater County like a soft veil, curling around the quiet roads that led to Orofino. The town sat nestled by the Clearwater River, its rhythms slow and familiar, a place where everyone knew one another by name, and the biggest noise on a Sunday came from the fire station's siren test. It was the kind of place people described as safe, steady, untouched by the chaos that filled evening news broadcasts. But in the fall of 2001, that calm was shattered forever. Before we uncover what really happened to Tim Harrington, the man whose disappearance haunted this valley for more than 2 decades, make sure to subscribe for more true stories that deserve to be told. Tim wasn't a man of grand gestures or fame. He was the kind of person who fixed a neighbor's porch without being asked, who pulled over to help when someone's truck broke down by the roadside. At 32, he was a husband, a father of 2, and a volunteer firefighter, the kind of role that demanded quiet courage rather than glory. His wife, Marlene, often said that firefighting wasn't just what Tim did, it was who he was. Their home stood just off Dent Bridge Road, surrounded by tall firs that whispered through the night. Inside, the house carried the warmth of a lived-in life, the scent of coffee at dawn, the faint hum of a radio playing country tunes, and children's laughter echoing down the hallway. Marlene remembered that sound more than anything else. It was what made the silence that followed his disappearance unbearable. Orofino in 2001 was small enough that people still left their doors unlocked. The local diner, Ellie's Place, opened at 6 every morning, serving hot coffee to farmers and firefighters alike. At the firehouse, camaraderie ran deep. They weren't just colleagues, they were family. That bond meant something in rural Idaho where help wasn't minutes away. It was the man next door, the woman across the street. Tim had joined the Orofino Volunteer Fire Department at 23, not for recognition but because he believed in service. He had a calm voice under pressure, the kind that steadied others in chaos. "If Tim's there," his captain Ron Keller once said, "you breathe a little easier." Those words would later echo painfully, a reminder of the kind of man they'd lost. The autumn of 2001 had been dry, the forest brittle and restless under the wind. Fires had sprung up across the county that September, small ones, mostly brush, but enough to keep the department on edge. By early October, things had finally slowed. Nights grew colder, the skies clearer. The men joked that they might finally get a full weekend off. On the evening of October 14th, Tim wrapped up his shift like he always did, meticulous, unhurried. He checked the hoses, cleaned the truck cab, and logged the final reports. His partner that night, Dennis Cole, remembered him smiling before leaving the station. He said he'd be home for dinner by 8, Dennis later told investigators. "I didn't think that'd be the last time I saw him." In a town like Orofino, time moves differently. Slowly, predictably. People count seasons, not years. But every community has its fracture point, a moment when normal life slips quietly into legend. For Orofino, that moment came the night Tim Harrington never made it home. The hills stood silent, the pines unmoved, as if holding their breath. The next morning, when Marlene looked out her window and saw the empty driveway, she told herself he'd gone in early for a call. By noon, she began to worry. By sundown, fear had taken root, and by nightfall the quiet hills of Idaho would never feel the same again. Timothy James Harrington wasn't born into heroism. He grew into it quietly, shaped by the rhythm of small-town life and the rugged beauty of Idaho's backcountry. He grew up in Orofino, the only son of a logging family that had worked these forests for generations. His father, Bill Harrington, was a stern but fair man who believed in hard work, straight talk, and keeping your word. Tim inherited that honesty and carried it like armor. From the time he was a boy, Tim understood responsibility. He helped his father split firewood before dawn and checked the traps along the river before school. In the evenings, when most kids were at the diner parking lot or the high school gym, Tim stayed home helping his mother patch the roof or fix the old Chevy. That sense of duty never left him. By his 20s, he was known around town as dependable, the guy who'd lend you his truck without asking when yours broke down. People trusted him because he never asked for anything in return. Marlene often said that when she first met him, It wasn't his looks that drew her in, but his steadiness. He listened, she once told a friend. In a world full of talkers, Tim just listened. They met at the Orofino County Fair in 1992. She was serving lemonade at a booth for the local church, and he was helping with a volunteer fire safety demonstration. When a gust of wind nearly toppled her tent, Tim caught it with one hand, smiled, and said, "Guess I'm good for something other than putting out fires." She laughed, and that laugh would become the soundtrack of his happiest years. By the late 90s, they'd built a life together, a small but cozy home, 2 children, and a rhythm that balanced duty and love. Marlene worked part-time at the elementary school, while Tim managed shifts at the lumber mill and volunteered for the fire department. Their children, Jake and Lacey, adored their father's quiet heroism. Jake, only 8 in 2001, used to wear his dad's old fire hat around the house, pretending to save the world from imaginary flames. Life in Orofino was simple, but not easy. The winters were harsh, and the summer wildfires kept everyone on alert. Yet it was that very unpredictability that gave Tim a sense of purpose. Fighting fires wasn't glamorous. It meant long hours, smoke-stung eyes, and the constant hum of danger. But to him it was a calling. When that alarm goes off, he once told Dennis Cole, his close friend and fellow firefighter, "You don't think. You just move. Someone's counting on you." That sense of responsibility extended beyond the firehouse. Neighbors remember him stopping to shovel driveways after a storm, fixing fences, or driving elderly residents to medical appointments. He carried a quiet decency that left an imprint long after he was gone. Inside the firehouse, he wasn't loud or commanding. He led by example. Calm under pressure, efficient, focused. Ron Keller, the fire chief, used to say, "Tim's the guy you want next to you when things get ugly. He doesn't flinch." What no one saw, though, was how much weight he carried behind that calm. The long shifts, the missed dinners, the constant worry about keeping everyone safe. It took its toll. Sometimes late at night, Marlene would find him sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark tree line. When she asked what was wrong, he'd shake his head and say softly, "Just thinking how quick things can change out there." Those words would echo years later, haunting her when the search for him began. But back then, they were just part of who he was. A man grounded in reality, aware of how fragile life could be, yet still choosing to protect others. Tim Harrington wasn't perfect, but in Orofino, he represented something rare, integrity that never needed to be spoken aloud. And on the night he disappeared, that quiet strength would be the very thing everyone remembered, the steady flame behind the uniform that refused to die out, even when the man himself was gone. October 14th, 2001, began like any other Sunday in Orofino. The air was sharp with the first bite of autumn, and the river shimmered under a pale morning sun. Tim Harrington had kissed Marlene goodbye just after breakfast, promising to bring home her favorite pie from Ellie's diner after his shift. "Don't stay late," she said, half teasing, half serious. He smiled. "You know me. In and out." Those were the last words she'd ever hear from him. At the Orofino Volunteer Fire Department, the day moved slowly. The men cleaned hoses, restocked medical kits, and checked equipment for the coming winter. The radio buzzed occasionally with minor calls, a grass fire here, a downed power line there, but nothing urgent. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the hills, painting the station windows in gold. Tim had been assigned to the evening check and vehicle inspection. He moved through the motions with practiced ease, clipboard in hand, boots echoing on the concrete floor, the faint scent of diesel and smoke filling the bay. He worked alongside Dennis Cole, his closest friend on the team. Dennis was the talkative one, always cracking jokes to keep the long shifts light. "You think Keller will ever fix that leaky valve on engine 2? Dennis asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Tim smirked. "You could always fix it yourself, if you spent half as much time working as you do talking." Dennis laughed. Fair point. It was the kind of banter that filled their nights at the station, unspoken trust woven through humor. For years they'd faced fires together, pulled people from wrecks, and shared the kind of bond only danger can forge. To everyone else, they were brothers. Around 7:15 p.m., a small call came in, a controlled burn check near Dent Bridge Road. Nothing serious. Keller logged it and asked Tim to swing by on his way home. Take a look, make sure it's out. Don't need another one flaring up overnight. Tim nodded, grabbed his jacket and loaded his gear into his pickup. The others remembered hearing the familiar sound of his truck starting, that low, uneven rumble, before it faded into the distance. Dennis watched from the doorway, lifting a hand in a lazy wave. See you tomorrow, man. Yeah, Tim called back. Tomorrow. Outside, the sky had turned a deep indigo, the kind that comes just before full dark. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Leaves rustled along the gravel as his headlights cut through the winding road leading out of town. He rolled the window down, letting the chill wake him a little. The world was quiet, too quiet maybe, except for the faint hiss of his tires against the dirt. Tim was a careful driver, but that night something tugged at him. Maybe it was the unease of isolation, the way the forest pressed in close, or the fatigue from too many nights on duty. He checked the radio once more, reported he was en route, and signed off. It was 7:42 p.m. That was the last time anyone heard his voice. Back at the station, Dennis finished locking up and glanced toward the dark road outside. A flicker of worry crossed his mind, but he brushed it off. Tim always double-checked everything. Maybe he'd stopped for coffee, maybe he was talking to someone along the route. Nothing unusual. When the clock struck 9, Marlene looked at the empty driveway and frowned. By 10, she called the firehouse. Hey, it's Marlene. Is Tim still there? Dennis answered, puzzled. No, he left hours ago. Didn't make it home? Her heart tightened. No. He said he'd be back for dinner. Outside her window, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like something unseen passing through. She told herself he was fine, that maybe the truck had broken down somewhere in the dark. But as midnight approached, and the headlights never appeared, a cold truth began to settle over her. Something was wrong. By sunrise on October 15th, the town of Orofino had begun to stir, but the Harrington house was already wide awake. Marlene stood by the window, clutching her coffee cup, though it had long gone cold. Tim's truck was still nowhere in sight. She called the firehouse again, her voice tight with worry. He never came home, she said. Not a word, not a call. The dispatcher promised to reach out to the sheriff. Within an hour, the quiet morning had turned into a flurry of concern. Sheriff Tom Wilkes, a man who'd known Tim since high school, arrived at the Harrington home just after 8 a.m. His presence was steady, the kind that usually brought comfort, but not this time. Maybe he ran into car trouble, he offered, scanning the driveway. We'll find him, Marlene. He's probably out there trying to fix that old truck of his. He would have called, she said, her voice breaking slightly. He always calls. By mid-morning, deputies began searching the routes between the fire station and Tim's home. The gravel roads wound through thick forest, some barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Volunteers joined in, firefighters, neighbors, even high school students with flashlights and walkie-talkies. The woods were dense with autumn decay, leaves crunching underfoot, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp soil. Around noon, a deputy radioed in. We found his truck, he said. The words froze Marlene where she stood. The vehicle was discovered 5 miles outside town, along an old Forest Service road near Elk Creek. The driver's door was locked, the keys gone. Inside, his jacket was neatly folded on the passenger seat, his flashlight missing. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints that led anywhere clear. Dennis Cole arrived at the scene not long after. He stared at the truck in disbelief. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. He knew these roads like the back of his hand. Sheriff Wilkes nodded grimly. And yet here we are. The search expanded quickly. Helicopters from Lewiston scanned the tree canopy, while K9 units combed the forest floor. The sound of rotor blades echoed across the valley as neighbors gathered along the dirt road, whispering prayers under their breath. The local paper sent a photographer, but no one wanted their picture taken. It didn't feel like news. It felt like heartbreak. Marlene refused to stay home. She joined the volunteers, walking for hours through brush and uneven ground, her legs trembling, her hands blistered from gripping branches. "Tim!" she shouted into the woods again and again, her voice swallowed by the trees. By the third day, exhaustion began to set in, and so did fear. The sheriff's office set up a temporary command post at the fire station. Maps covered the walls, red circles marking areas already searched. Each evening, as the sun sank and the air turned cold, the volunteers returned, tired, muddy, and empty-handed. Ron Keller tried to keep spirits up. "We'll find him," he told the crew, though the words felt thinner each day. On the fifth night, Marlene sat on her porch wrapped in a blanket, the silence of the woods pressing in. Her neighbor Linda brought her soup, but she barely touched it. "He's out there somewhere," she whispered. "I can feel it." Linda didn't know what to say. Sometimes hope sounded too much like denial. By the end of the first week, the official search was scaled back. Reporters began to appear, asking if Tim had enemies, debts, or secrets. Marlene refused to entertain any of it. "My husband didn't run away," she told them firmly. "Something happened to him." But even as she spoke those words, uncertainty crept in. The days turned into nights, the calls stopped coming, and the forest, vast and indifferent, kept its silence. Somewhere out there, among the shadows and the rustle of pine needles, the truth waited, buried deeper than anyone could yet imagine. In the weeks after Tim vanished, Orofino felt different. The town still moved, but slower, as though everyone was waiting for something that refused to arrive. The fire station flag stayed at half-mast, and at the diner people spoke his name in whispers, glancing toward the window as if he might walk through the door at any moment. But Marlene knew he wouldn't. Every morning she woke to the same ache, the empty space in bed beside her, the untouched coffee mug, the silence that replaced laughter. The sheriff's office continued to investigate, but each visit brought fewer answers. "We're doing everything we can," Sheriff Wilkes told her one afternoon, standing on her porch, hat in hand. "But the leads are drying up." "Then dig deeper," she said firmly. "You know Tim, he wouldn't just disappear." Wilkes sighed. "I know, Marlene, believe me, I know. But we've searched every mile of that forest. Then you're searching in the wrong place." It was the first time her voice cracked, not from sadness, but from anger. That anger became her fuel. She plastered missing posters across Clearwater County, printed in black and white with his kind eyes staring out from beneath his fire helmet. She spoke with reporters, called state agencies, even reached out to a retired private investigator in Spokane. Everyone promised to help, but as weeks turned into months, her calls went unanswered more often than not. Jake and Lacey tried to stay strong. Jake, only 8, would sit by the window at night, flashlight in hand, saying softly, "Maybe Dad'll see the light and come home." Marlene would stroke his hair, fighting tears. "He knows where home is, sweetheart. He'll find his way." But in her heart, doubt had begun to grow. Cold, heavy, relentless. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the forest where searchers had once walked, covering any remaining trace of Tim's path. The case grew cold, literally and figuratively. Volunteers returned to their routines, and the sheriff's updates grew brief. At the fire station, Tim's locker remained untouched, his nameplate polished, his boots lined up neatly on the floor. Dennis Cole stopped by Marlene's house often at first, checking on her, bringing groceries, fixing the porch light. But as months passed, even he came less frequently, his visits shorter, his tone quieter. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table, Marlene stared at the file she had begun keeping, notes from every call, every clue, every piece of rumor that reached her. It had become her ritual, her way of holding on to him. Linda, her neighbor, sat across from her, worry etched across her face. "You can't keep living like this," Linda said softly. "You're wearing yourself out." "I can't stop," Marlene replied, her voice steady. "If I stop, it's like saying he's gone for good." Linda reached for her hand. "You need rest. What I need is the truth." As spring thawed the snow, she resumed her search. She drove the back roads, retraced the paths Tim might have taken, stopped at gas stations asking if anyone had seen his truck that night. Most shook their heads. Some avoided eye contact. "People don't just vanish," she muttered to herself more than once. "Someone knows something." Rumors began to swirl. whispers that maybe Tim had chosen to disappear, or that something at the fire station wasn't as it seemed. Marlene ignored them, but they stung. Every insinuation felt like a betrayal. One afternoon, she confronted Sheriff Wilkes again. "Are you even looking anymore?" she demanded. He exhaled slowly. "We haven't stopped, Marlene. But we need new evidence. Without it, the case goes nowhere." "Then I'll find it myself," she said, standing tall, and she meant it. That night, she placed Tim's photo by the window, the one where he was smiling in uniform, sunlight on his face. "I'm not done," she whispered. "I'll find you." The wind rustled through the trees outside, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and rain, a reminder that somewhere out there, the forest still held his secret. And Marlene Harrington wasn't going to stop until it gave him back. Time didn't heal Orofino. It just softened the edges of the wound until it blended into the rhythm of life. By 2005, the posters had faded from telephone poles, their ink washed away by rain and snow. The town moved forward, as towns do, though the empty chair at the fire station and the vacant look in Marlene's eyes were constant reminders that not everyone had been able to. Marlene kept the same house, refusing to move. "If he comes back," she'd tell Linda, "I want him to find home exactly how he left it." Inside, the house was frozen in time. Tim's jacket still hung on the hook by the door, his favorite mug sitting on the shelf. The smell of smoke from old firewood lingered in the walls, faint but permanent, like a memory that refused to fade. The years passed quietly. Jake grew tall, his father's broad shoulders and steady eyes showing through more with each passing year. Lacey, once a bright little girl chasing her brother around the yard, became quieter as she got older, cautious with hope, careful with words. They both learned to navigate life under the weight of their father's absence. In 2010, the fire department held a small ceremony marking the 9th anniversary of Tim's disappearance. The men lined up in their uniforms, heads bowed as the siren wailed once in his honor. Marlene stood among them, her expression unreadable. After the service, Dennis Cole approached her. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said gently. "I've been alone for a long time," she replied, eyes fixed on the mountains. He nodded but didn't answer. Something unspoken lingered between them, a mix of shared grief and quiet discomfort. As technology advanced, she hoped it might bring new answers. She reached out to every new sheriff, every investigative unit, sending letters and emails that began with the same words. "My husband disappeared in 2001. His name was Tim Harrington." Most responses were polite but predictable. "Without new evidence, ma'am, it's hard to reopen a case that cold." By 2015, even those replies stopped coming. The world changed around her. New houses were built, roads widened. The younger generation barely remembered the name that once filled local headlines. At the grocery store, the cashier, a girl barely out of high school, once asked, "Are you related to that firefighter they named the trail after?" Marlene smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "He was my husband." At night, when the town settled into its quiet routine, she would sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the forest. The same sounds that once comforted her, the wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, now carried a heaviness she couldn't shake. Each sound reminded her that somewhere out there, the land held the truth. Jake joined the army right after graduation, determined to make his father proud. Before leaving, he told Marlene, "If I can't bring him home, I'll at least live the way he taught me." She hugged him tightly, whispering, "That's all he ever wanted." Lacey stayed closer to home, studying nursing at Lewiston, visiting often to help her mother with the house. The years marked them, but they didn't break them. In 2021, a new sheriff took office. Daniel Brooks, younger than Wilkes, methodical, and known for revisiting old cases. Marlene didn't expect much when he stopped by to introduce himself, yet something in his calm curiosity stirred the smallest spark of hope. "I've been reviewing past files," he said, laying a thick folder on the table. "Your husband's case stood out to me." Her heart skipped. "After all this time?" Brooks nodded. "Sometimes time helps, Mrs. Harrington. People talk. Technology improves. Maybe there's something we missed." For the first time in years, She allowed herself to imagine the possibility that the truth, however painful, might finally come to light. By the spring of 2022, 2 decades had passed since the night Tim Harrington disappeared, and yet the name still carried a quiet weight in Orofino. Sheriff Daniel Brooks sat in his office one rainy afternoon, the sound of drops tapping against the window, flipping through the old case file. The photos were faded, the reports yellowed with age. Still, something in the details bothered him. A sense that the investigation had ended too soon, that too many things had been accepted as coincidence. Brooks wasn't the kind of man to leave questions unanswered. He had grown up in nearby Kooskia, served 10 years with the Idaho State Police, and believed that no mystery was too old to be solved. When he reopened the Harrington case officially, he began by re-examining every piece of evidence collected in 2001. "Let's look at this with 2022 eyes," he told his deputy, Carla Jensen. "Not 2001 thinking," Carla nodded. "You really think we'll find something after all this time?" Brooks glanced at the file. "I don't know, but time doesn't erase truth. It just hides it better." He reached out to the Idaho State Forensic Lab in Meridian, requesting that the physical evidence be reprocessed using modern techniques: soil analysis, trace fiber comparison, DNA recovery from degraded materials. Even a single hair or fragment could tell a story that technology in 2001 had missed. When the call came a few weeks later confirming they'd located the original evidence box, Brooks drove down himself to pick it up. "If this case matters to her, after 20 years, he said quietly to Carla, then it should matter to us now." Marlene couldn't quite believe it when Brooks knocked on her door that summer. "We're taking another look," he said gently. She hesitated, hands trembling slightly. "People have said that before," she replied. "It never goes anywhere." "I'm not people," Brooks said simply. "I'm a man who hates loose ends." He spent weeks mapping out the area around Elk Creek Road, overlaying satellite images with old search maps. New digital tools made it possible to reconstruct the terrain as it had been in 2001, before logging had changed the roads and growth had swallowed trails. When Brooks showed Marlene the 3D model on his laptop, she leaned closer, eyes widening. "That bend," she whispered, pointing to the screen. "He used to drive through there after late shifts." That small comment redirected the entire search grid. The sheriff's department began working with a state geospatial team to analyze tire impressions from the original photos. Under enhanced imaging, a pattern emerged, one that didn't match Tim's pickup but possibly another vehicle from the fire department fleet. Brooks felt his pulse quicken. "Why would another truck have been there that night?" he murmured. Meanwhile, volunteers used updated GPS mapping to re-explore sections of forest previously inaccessible due to rough terrain. Drones scanned dense areas where human searchers couldn't safely reach. One afternoon, Carla returned from a drone survey with images showing a patch of disturbed soil near a ravine that hadn't been documented before. "Could be animal activity," she said, handing Brooks the tablet. "Or not." The sheriff studied the coordinates and then looked up toward the horizon, the forest stretching endless and dark. "We're going out there tomorrow," he said. That night, Marlene sat at her kitchen table staring at the phone, unable to sleep. For years she had begged for movement, for something, anything, to shake the silence that had settled over Tim's name. Now, for the first time in decades, she felt that silence begin to shift. In the stillness of her home, surrounded by the echoes of a life once whole, Marlene whispered into the dark, "Find him, please." And somewhere deep in the Idaho woods, the earth, untouched for 21 years, was about to give up its secret. The search team gathered before dawn, the air crisp and heavy with the smell of wet earth. Sheriff Brooks led the convoy down Elk Creek Road, the same winding path Tim Harrington had driven more than 2 decades earlier. The forest loomed thick and quiet, pine needles damp from the night's rain. To Marlene, who followed in her car behind the patrol trucks, it felt like retracing a nightmare she'd never woken from. At the site, the team unloaded equipment, metal detectors, soil probes, and a portable ground-penetrating radar. Carla Jensen unfolded the drone images from the previous week. Disturbed terrain starts here, she said, pointing to a section near a steep drop where erosion had eaten into the hillside. If something was buried or hidden years ago, this is where nature might have revealed it. Brooks nodded. Let's keep it quiet. No media, no leaks. We're just here to see what the ground wants to tell us. Hours passed with little more than mud, rocks, and silence. The only sounds were the steady hum of equipment and the occasional caw of a crow circling overhead. Marlene waited by her car, her hands clenched around a small wooden cross she carried everywhere since Tim disappeared. Around midday, one of the deputies called out, "Sheriff, you might want to see this." The entire group moved toward the sound. Beneath the thick layer of pine needles, a glint of metal had caught the sunlight, the corroded remains of a flashlight, half buried and crushed by time. Carla crouched down, brushing the dirt carefully. "This looks old," she said quietly. "Same model issued to volunteer firefighters back in the early 2000s. Brooks's throat tightened. "Bag it," he said. "Mark the coordinates." They continued digging along the slope, the soil darker, softer. When the radar indicated a density change 2 feet down, the sheriff's heart began to pound. "Slowly," he ordered. "No one rush this." As the last layer of earth was brushed away, silence fell over the group. There, half hidden beneath decades of forest growth, were fragments of fabric, a weathered uniform patch, the faint outline of the Orofino Volunteer Fire Department emblem still visible under the grime. And beside it, what no one wanted to find but everyone knew was there, a human bone, pale and fragile against the dark soil. Marlene saw Brooks walking toward her, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, softly, "We found something." Her breath caught. Something or someone. He met her eyes. "We won't know for sure until forensics confirm. But I think it's him." The world seemed to tilt. She didn't cry. Not yet. Grief, after so many years, had calcified into something deeper, quieter. She just nodded, pressing the cross to her chest. "Bring him home," she whispered. The remains were carefully collected, catalogued and sent to the state lab in Boise. The flashlight, the uniform fragment and several personal items, including what appeared to be a rusted wedding ring, were sealed as evidence. The drive back to Orofino was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the sheriff's radio. Weeks later, DNA analysis confirmed what Marlene had always known in her heart. The remains belonged to Timothy James Harrington. After 22 years, he had finally been found. The town reacted with stunned relief. Flags flew half-mast once again, candles lined the fire station steps, and neighbors brought flowers to Marlene's porch. "At least you have answers now," Linda told her gently. But answers were not peace, not yet. Something about the discovery didn't sit right with Sheriff Brooks. The location, the condition of the body, the missing keys, none of it fit the idea of an accident. As the first snow began to fall that winter, Brooks sat in his office staring at the evidence board, the corroded flashlight photo pinned in the center. He whispered to himself, this wasn't bad luck. And deep down he knew. The story of what happened to Tim Harrington was only beginning to unfold. Winter settled over Clearwater County like a heavy blanket, but inside the sheriff's office the air felt charged. The discovery of Tim Harrington's remains had brought closure for some, and new questions for others. Sheriff Daniel Brooks sat at his desk, surrounded by files, the glow of the desk lamp reflecting off a wall now covered in photographs, maps, and timelines. Something didn't add up. The medical examiner's report had confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, not consistent with a fall or an accident. Tim's injuries were deliberate. The angle, the impact, the absence of defensive wounds, it all suggested he had never seen it coming. Brooks tapped his pen against the report. He didn't crash. He didn't wander off. Someone put him there, he said quietly. Deputy Carla Jensen leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Who'd want to hurt a guy like Tim? That's what we're going to find out. Brooks opened a folder marked 2001 Statements. Start with everyone who was at the firehouse that night. I want fresh interviews. People remember things differently when time has passed. Within days, the sheriff's team began revisiting old witnesses. Most of them were older now, retired, grey-haired, weary of the past. Yet when Tim's name came up, their eyes still softened. "He was solid," said Ron Keller, the former fire chief. "Best man I ever had on the crew." Brooks nodded. "And Dennis Cole?" Keller hesitated. "Dennis took it hard back then. Wouldn't talk much after the search ended. Moved down to Grangeville a few years later. Haven't heard from him since." That name lingered in Brooks's mind. Dennis Cole, the last person to see Tim alive. The old reports had painted him as cooperative but vague. His timeline that night was never airtight, and now, with fresh forensic evidence suggesting foul play, the sheriff couldn't ignore him. "Let's track him down," Brooks told Carla. When they found Dennis living in a small trailer park outside Grangeville, he looked older than his years. His hands shook slightly when Brooks showed his badge. "We're reopening Tim Harrington's case," Brooks said. "Need to ask a few questions." Dennis's eyes flickered. After all this time, what for? Because his death wasn't an accident. The words hung in the air. For a moment, Dennis said nothing. Then he laughed nervously. "You're saying somebody killed Tim? That's crazy. He probably slipped off that road." Brooks studied him carefully. "You said you saw him leave the station around 7:15, right?" "Yeah. He said he was heading home." "But you never followed up when he didn't make it." "I thought he stopped somewhere." "We all did." "Did you?" Brooks asked quietly. "Or did you already know he wouldn't make it home?" Dennis's expression hardened. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Sheriff. Tim was my friend." Brooks closed his notebook. "Then you won't mind helping us find whoever did this?" Back in Orofino, whispers spread quickly. A sheriff asking questions, a reopened murder case. It stirred the quiet town from its long slumber. At Ellie's diner, people lowered their voices over coffee, wondering if the truth had been closer than anyone realized. Marlene tried to avoid the gossip, but she felt it in every glance, every half-finished sentence. "They're talking about him again," she told Linda one evening. "Maybe that's a good thing," Linda said softly. "Maybe they'll finally talk about what really happened." That night, Brooks sat alone in his office, staring at the map again. The location of the body didn't match Tim's supposed route home. It was miles off course. "He didn't drive there on his own," he muttered. "Someone took him there." He leaned back, closing his eyes as the cold wind rattled the window pane. 22 years of silence, a town built on loyalty, and one man who knew too much. The pieces were finally beginning to move. By early spring, Sheriff Brooks had gathered enough inconsistencies in Dennis Cole's statements to make him more than a witness. The sheriff didn't rush. He built his case carefully, piece by piece. Each interview, each old log entry, and each recovered document painted a clearer picture of that October night in 2001. And the more Brooks dug, the more Dennis's story unraveled. One morning, Carla walked into the office holding a thin manila envelope. "Sheriff, you'll want to see this," she said. Inside was a forensic report, soil residue taken from the undercarriage of Dennis Cole's old pickup, recently impounded from a used car lot where he'd sold it years earlier. The lab confirmed the sample matched the clay composition from Elk Creek Road. Brooks exhaled slowly. That puts his truck at the site. That same afternoon, they brought Dennis in for questioning. He looked uneasy, his once confident posture replaced by nervous fidgeting. Brooks slid the photos across the table, the remains, the recovered flashlight, and now the lab report. "You told us you went straight home after Tim left the station," Brooks began calmly. "But the evidence says your truck was on that road the same night he disappeared." Dennis rubbed his forehead. "It's been 20 years, Sheriff. You think I remember where I drove that night? You remembered enough to tell us you went home," Brooks replied evenly. "So, which is it?" Silence filled the room. Carla leaned forward slightly, watching him. "You and Tim were close," she said. "People said you two were like brothers." Dennis's eyes darted to her. "We were." "He was my best friend." "Then why did you lie?" Brooks asked. Dennis slammed his hand on the table. "I didn't kill him." The words cracked through the room. His breathing quickened, hands shaking. "He was upset that night, all right." "We argued." "Yeah. About the department, about funding, about Keller playing favorites, but I left before he did. Brooks kept his voice low. An argument? That never came up in your first statement. I didn't think it mattered, Dennis muttered. It wasn't about anything serious. But it mattered to Tim, Carla said. People heard shouting that night. Dennis's eyes widened. Who told you that? Brooks didn't answer. Dennis, we're giving you a chance to tell us what really happened. If this was an accident, if something got out of hand, well, now's the time to say it. He looked down, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. For a long moment it seemed like he might speak, but when he finally lifted his head, his expression had hardened again. I've got nothing to say without a lawyer. The interrogation ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any confession. Brooks stood in the hallway afterward, his jaw tight. He's hiding something, he said quietly. Carla nodded. And he's scared. 2 days later, a warrant was issued for Dennis Cole's arrest based on forensic evidence and conflicting testimony. The town of Orofino erupted. Headlines filled local papers. Arrest made in 22-year-old disappearance of volunteer firefighter. People stopped each other on Main Street to talk, their voices a mix of disbelief and anger. For years, Dennis had been a familiar face. At barbecues, church events, firehouse reunions, the idea that he could have had anything to do with Tim's death felt impossible. Marlene received the call from Sheriff Brooks personally. We've taken Dennis Cole into custody, he told her. She sat very still, her voice barely a whisper. After all these years, are you sure? As sure as we can be, Brooks said. But it's not over yet. That night, as Orofino buzzed with the shock of betrayal, Marlene sat alone by the window where she'd once waited for Tim to come home. The flashing lights of passing patrol cars reflected faintly against the glass. She didn't feel relief. Only a quiet ache that the truth, even when it arrived, could still hurt this much. News travels fast in small towns, and in Orofino it spreads like wildfire. By the next morning, Dennis Cole's arrest was the only topic on everyone's lips. At the post office, the diner, and the fire station, conversations started in whispers and ended in disbelief. Dennis? No way, said one of the older firefighters, shaking his head as he refilled his coffee. He and Tim were like brothers. Others avoided talking altogether, afraid of saying the wrong thing, or perhaps afraid of what might come out if they did. The Orofino Volunteer Fire Department shut its doors for the day, a sign posted on the door reading, "Operations temporarily suspended." For men and women who'd once shared long nights beside Dennis, the news hit hard. Some refused to believe it. They must have made a mistake, said Captain Ron Keller, his voice weary. Dennis would have given his life for that man. Others weren't so sure anymore. You think you know someone, murmured a young recruit, staring at Tim's memorial plaque on the wall. Marlene tried to avoid town that day, but there was no hiding from the storm. She stopped by the grocery store for bread and milk, and the room fell silent when she entered. Linda met her at the door. You shouldn't have come out, she whispered softly. I have to live, Linda, Marlene replied, clutching her bag tightly. I can't hide every time someone says his name. But people... I know what people do, Marlene interrupted, her tone steady. They talk. They always have. Let them. At home, the phone rang constantly. Reporters, neighbors, old friends from across the state. Some wanted comments, others offered condolences, as if she'd lost him all over again. That night, she turned off the ringer and sat by the window, watching the town lights flicker across the valley. Why now? She whispered to herself. Why after all these years? Across town, Sheriff Brooks prepared a brief statement for the press. Standing in front of the courthouse steps, he faced a crowd of cameras and curious faces. After a comprehensive reinvestigation, he said firmly, we have arrested Dennis Cole in connection with the 2001 death of volunteer firefighter Timothy Harrington. Evidence has led us to believe this was not an accident. The investigation remains ongoing. Questions erupted immediately. What kind of evidence? Was there a motive? Brooks refused to elaborate. Out of respect for the Harrington family and the integrity of the case, we'll release details when appropriate. As he walked back inside, he caught a glimpse of a few firefighters standing in the back, their faces pale, their eyes uncertain. That night, Orofino didn't sleep. The tavern stayed open late. The diner's neon sign flickered until dawn. Some residents defended Dennis fiercely. "He's been part of this community for 30 years, one man said. "You think a guy like that could just kill someone and go to work the next day?" Others weren't convinced. "People hide worse things," replied another. At the firehouse, Keller unlocked the door alone, walking past the empty lockers that smelled faintly of smoke and oil. He stopped at Tim's, untouched since the day he vanished. Then his eyes drifted to Dennis's, right beside it. The nameplate had been removed, leaving only the faint outline of where it once hung. He whispered under his breath, "God help us all." For Marlene, the arrest didn't bring peace, only confusion. She sat at the kitchen table late that evening, her children beside her. Jake, now grown, clenched his jaw. "I used to look up to that man," he said bitterly. "He carried Dad's casket at the memorial." Lacey reached for her mother's hand. "What if they're wrong?" Marlene stared down at the wood grain beneath her fingertips. "Then the truth will prove it," she said quietly. "But if they're right, then we'll finally know what really happened that night." Outside, snow began to fall softly over the town, the same quiet flakes that had covered the forest floor where Tim's body once lay. But now, beneath the calm, Orofino buzzed with unease, as if the ghosts of loyalty and guilt had come back to stand among them. The courthouse in Lewiston was packed the morning the trial began. Reporters lined the steps, microphones flashing, their breath visible in the cold March air. For the people of Orofino, it wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. 22 years of silence were finally breaking open, and everyone wanted to see what truth would crawl out from underneath. Inside, Marlene sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together. Her children flanked her on either side, Jake's jaw set, Lacey's eyes red from lack of sleep. Across the room sat Dennis Cole, thinner than most remembered, his hair now fully grey. He wore a simple navy suit, his wrists free but his expression hollow. When his eyes met Marlene's, he looked away. The prosecution opened with quiet precision. "This is not a story about an accident," the district attorney began. "This is the story of a man betrayed by someone he trusted, a friend, a fellow firefighter, a brother in duty." He laid out the timeline, the argument at the fire station, the forensic evidence linking Dennis's truck to Elk Creek Road. Every detail came like a slow hammer, each strike measured and deliberate. When Dennis's defense took the floor, their strategy was clear: to sow doubt. 22 years, his attorney said, pacing before the jury. 22 years of weather, erosion, lost evidence, fading memories. You cannot convict a man on ghosts. The defense claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that contamination was possible, that even the soil sample could have been misattributed. The first week was dominated by testimony from law enforcement. Sheriff Brooks took the stand, his calm presence commanding attention. "We revisited every piece of evidence," he said firmly. "The science doesn't lie." Dennis Cole's truck was at the scene where Tim Harrington's body was found, and the injuries sustained were consistent with a deliberate strike. The defense attorney crossed his arms. "Sheriff, isn't it true that none of this was proven in 2001? Brooks didn't flinch. "It's true that the technology didn't exist then, but it does now. And now it proves what we missed." The courtroom hung on every word. Outside, cameras broadcasted updates to a state suddenly fascinated by the quiet Idaho town once forgotten. Midway through the trial, Marlene was called to testify. Her voice trembled, but never broke. "Tim wasn't the kind of man to disappear," she said. "He would have come home to his kids no matter what. If someone tells you otherwise, they didn't know him." The defense declined to cross-examine her. Some truths they knew couldn't be shaken. When Dennis finally took the stand, the room fell silent. He denied everything. "We argued that night, sure," he admitted. "But that's all it was. I went home. I didn't follow him. I didn't touch him." The prosecutor stepped forward, placing a photograph on the evidence stand of the crushed flashlight found near the remains. "This was issued to the Orofino Volunteer Fire Department in 2001. Only 5 were given out that year. 4 were accounted for, the 5th belonged to you. Dennis's lips parted, but no words came. The silence spoke louder than any confession. After days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of manslaughter. The courtroom exhaled, a single collective breath after decades of holding it in. Marlene closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Jake reached for her hand. "It's over," he whispered. But in her heart, she knew nothing truly ends when the people you love are gone. As Dennis was led out in handcuffs, Brooks watched him go with a heavy heart. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like victory, just the closing of a long, painful chapter. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sky broke open into sunlight, pale and cold but clear at last. The verdict rippled through Orofino like the echo of a long-awaited storm finally breaking. For days, the town felt suspended, quiet, reflective, uncertain of how to return to normal life after decades of speculation and grief. At the fire station, Tim Harrington's photograph was moved from the missing wall to a new display framed in oak beneath a brass plaque that read, "In service, in sacrifice, in memory." Marlene stood before it one afternoon, the faint hum of the building filling the silence. The scent of smoke and diesel lingered, familiar, comforting, almost holy. She reached out and brushed her fingers across the glass. "You're home now," she whispered. Behind her, footsteps approached. Sheriff Brooks nodded respectfully, keeping his voice low. "We'll be holding a memorial next week. The department wants to do it right this time." Marlene gave a small nod. He'd like that. Outside, the air was warmer than it had been in months. The snow had melted from the roofs, revealing green patches of grass that hadn't seen sunlight all winter. Life was slowly returning, and so was something else. Forgiveness, though not easily. The memorial drew nearly the whole town. Rows of folding chairs filled the open field behind the station. Jake spoke first, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My father taught me that being brave isn't about running into fires. It's about showing up, even when you're afraid. For 22 years, my mother showed me what that means." Lacey followed, her words soft but firm. "We lost our dad, but we never lost his example. He lived for others, and we'll keep living by that." As she sat, Marlene felt a warmth spread through her, pride, sorrow, and peace interwoven. The firehouse bell rang once, clear and solemn. The crowd stood in silence, hats over hearts, while the wind whispered through the pines as if the forest itself were listening. After the ceremony, people approached her quietly. Neighbors, old classmates, even some of Dennis's relatives. No one spoke of anger. They spoke of healing, of lessons learned, of time finally loosening its hold. One elderly firefighter placed a folded flag in her hands. "He was one of the best of us," he said. "We'll never forget him." That evening, Marlene returned home to the porch that had once been a place of waiting. Now it felt like a place of peace. The light from the kitchen window spilled across the steps, and the familiar creak of the wooden boards beneath her feet carried echoes of the past, the sound of boots, of laughter, of life. She sat with a cup of coffee, looking out toward the dark line of trees where her world had once fallen apart. "It's over," she said softly to the night, "and yet it's not." In the weeks that followed, she visited the spot near Elk Creek where Tim had been found. Sheriff Brooks went with her, standing at a respectful distance while she knelt by the simple marker now placed there. The forest was quiet, the air sweet with pine and earth. She pressed her palm against the ground. "You were never lost," she murmured. "We just didn't know where to look." Brooks approached gently. "He'd be proud of you, Marlene. Not many could have carried what you did for this long." She looked up, her eyes bright but steady. "He'd tell me I was stubborn." Brooks smiled faintly. Sometimes stubbornness is just another word for love. As they walked back toward the car, sunlight filtered through the treetops, casting long golden lines across the dirt road. The same road Tim had driven all those years ago. The same one that had taken him away and in a way brought him home again. Months passed, but Tim Harrington's story didn't fade back into silence. It transformed. What began as a tragedy became a movement of remembrance, reflection, and purpose. The Orofino Volunteer Fire Department, once burdened by guilt and unanswered questions, was reborn through the strength of those who refused to let Tim's legacy die. The department renamed its annual charity event the Harrington Honor Drive, raising funds for families of fallen first responders. For the first time in years, the firehouse buzzed with laughter again. Not careless laughter, but the kind that comes when pain begins to heal. The building that once held only echoes of grief now carried new life. Jake returned home that summer after completing his tour with the army. He'd written to his mother months before, saying he wanted to come back to Orofino for good this time. When he walked into the fire station and saw his father's name engraved on the memorial, he stood for a long time, his hand resting on the metal. Ron Keller, older now but still in uniform, joined him quietly. "He'd be proud," Keller said. Jake nodded. "He's the reason I learned what service means. Maybe it's time I picked up where he left off." And he did. Jake applied to join the department as a volunteer, the same position his father had taken all those years ago. The training was hard, the hours long, but he felt closer to Tim with every call, every drill, every quiet night at the station, listening to the hum of the trucks. "I get it now," he told Marlene one evening over dinner. Why he loved it so much. It wasn't about the fires, and it was about the people. Lacey found her own way of honoring their father. She started a scholarship in his name for students in Clearwater County who wanted to pursue emergency services. The first recipient was a young woman named Erin Fields, who'd grown up hearing Tim's story from her grandfather. "He was a hero before anyone called him one," she wrote in her essay. "I want to serve with that same quiet courage." For Marlene, the future felt different, not lighter but steadier. The ache of loss never truly left her, yet it became something she could live alongside. She began attending the department's monthly gatherings again, bringing homemade pies like she used to when Tim was alive. The younger firefighters treated her with reverence, but she always laughed and said, "Don't call me ma'am, I'm just Marlene." Sheriff Brooks continued to visit occasionally, often on quiet evenings when the valley glowed orange with sunset. "Do you ever think about moving?" he asked her once. She shook her head. "This town gave me everything I loved and took it away, too, but it's still home." He smiled at that. "Then I suppose it's home for all of us." In 2024, the state recognized the Orofino Volunteer Fire Department for its community service, honoring Tim posthumously for his dedication. During the ceremony, Marlene accepted the award on his behalf. "Tim didn't see himself as a hero," she said into the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "He just believed that when someone needed help, you showed up. That's all he ever did, and all he ever asked of anyone else." As applause rose around her, she looked up toward the banner overhead. "The fire still burns." It wasn't just a slogan. It was truth. The fire Tim carried, and of duty, compassion, and quiet strength, had passed into everyone who knew him, into the very soil of Orofino itself. When the crowd dispersed and dusk settled, Marlene stood alone for a moment, the sound of the river whispering in the distance. "You're still here," she said softly. "Not in the way I once prayed for, but in every way that matters." The morning sun rose over the hills of Orofino, warm and golden, painting the river in bands of amber light. It had been nearly 23 years since Tim Harrington's disappearance, a lifetime for some, a moment for others. The town had changed, but his name still lingered like a steady flame that refused to go out. Every October, the anniversary of his last shift brought people together. The firefighters wore black armbands, the sirens sounded once at noon, and the community gathered by the riverbank where a new memorial now stood. A simple stone engraved with words that had come to define both Tim's life and the town's resilience. "Courage isn't loud. It's steady." Marlene stood quietly near the front, her hands clasped in front of her, her silver hair catching the morning light. Jake and Lacey stood beside her, their own children tugging gently at their sleeves. The next generation, kids who had only heard stories about the man who'd once kept this town safe, listened as the new fire chief spoke. "We remember not just a firefighter, but a friend," he said. "Someone who taught us that true service doesn't end when the shift does." As the crowd bowed their heads, Marlene closed her eyes. She could almost hear Tim's voice again, soft, certain, laughing at something only he found funny. The ache in her chest wasn't sharp anymore. It had become something deeper, something solid, love transformed into legacy. After the ceremony, people lingered, sharing memories. An old neighbor recalled Tim fixing her roof in the middle of a thunderstorm. A young volunteer firefighter, no older than Tim had been when he joined, said quietly, "I didn't know him. But every time we go out on a call, I think about how he would have handled it." Marlene smiled, touched by how far his spirit had traveled beyond his time. Later that afternoon, she visited the trail dedicated in his honor, a winding path along the Clearwater River, shaded by cedar and pine. Birds called from the branches, and the sound of running water blended with the wind through the trees. She walked slowly, stopping at a wooden bench near the halfway point. The plaque read, "In loving memory of firefighter Timothy J. Harrington, 1969-2001. The flame endures." She sat for a long while, letting the peace of the place settle around her. Sheriff Brooks had once told her that justice didn't bring closure, only clarity. He was right. Closure wasn't about endings. It was about learning to live with what remained. She thought of Dennis Cole sometimes, not with hatred but with a quiet sadness. Both men had been lost that night, each in their own way. But Tim had found his way back, through truth, through time, through every person who still spoke his name. Jake joined her on the bench, a travel mug in his hand. "The department's growing," he said with a small grin. "We've got new recruits this year. They're learning fast." She looked at him proudly. "So you sound like your father," he chuckled softly. "Guess I finally understand what he meant about service." Marlene nodded, her gaze on the river. "It's not about being remembered, Jake. It's about leaving something worth remembering." He smiled, following her eyes toward the current. Then he did exactly that. As the day faded, the sound of the river deepened, rolling gently against the banks. The fire station's siren sounded one final time in the distance, a tribute, a promise, a reminder. Marlene rose, took one last look at the horizon, and whispered, "You kept your word, Tim. You came home." Before leaving, she turned to the camera of time itself, the unseen audience who had followed every beat of this story, and her voice, calm but resolute, carried the message that outlived her pain. Thank you for remembering him. And if Tim's story moved you, subscribe and stay with us as we continue sharing the stories of those who deserve to be remembered. And don't forget, the next video waiting for you is another true story of courage and truth. The river flowed on, endless and bright, as the fire that began with one man's devotion continued to burn quietly in every heart that remembered his name.